On the pasuk in Parshas Toldos that says Vayatek Mishom, that Yitzchak moves Vayachper Be'er Acheres, and he digs another well. V'loy Ravu Aleh, and then finally there's no arguments, there's no quarrelings regarding this well. The pasuk says Vayikra Shma Rechoivos, he calls it Rechoivos. Vayomer, and he says Ki Ato Hirchiv Hashem Lanu, now Hashem has given us plenty of space. Ufarinu Ba'aretz. It's going to be this word, ufarinu ba'aretz, that's going to be discussed in the sicha. What does ufarinu ba'aretz mean? So Rashi quotes these words, ufarinu ba'aretz, and says, kitargumoy, as the Targum translates it, v'nipush be'aro. So what exactly is the pasuk saying? What is Rashi telling us? So the Mefarshim explained, what Rashi is trying to tell us is, seemingly the word ufarinu would be in the past tense. But since the pasuk says Ki ato hirchiv Hashem lanu, that now Hashem has given us ample space, how could ufarinu mean in the past Hashem made us already ufarinu ba'aretz? This is why Rashi translates the word ufarinu, that here we are to understand it v'nipush, that the Targum says v'nipush, which indicates that we're speaking about something that's going to happen in the future. However, the Rebbe says, simply it's very, very difficult to say that that's what Rashi is trying to tell us. Because we find so many times in the Torah, words that on their own would be Lashon Avar, on their own would be in the past tense. And when you put a Vav there, it changes it to the future. And therefore, simply in our case as well, the word Ufarinu with the Vav has no problem as meaning Ufarinu, that in the future we will multiply. In the future, we will increase, so there's no question. There's no need for Rashi to come to explain, just like Rashi doesn't explain this anywhere else. Furthermore, the Rebbe says we have to understand, Rashi is explaining the word ufarinu. He's not explaining the word ba'aretz, in the land. Because when Rashi quotes the Targum that says v'nipush be'ara, be'ara meaning in the land, it's not adding any explanation to the word ba'aretz. So he's not explaining the word ba'aretz by just bringing us a Targum word on that. If that's the case, why is there a need for Rashi to quote from the pasuk ufarinu ba'aretz? To explain this, the Rebbe says, we need to actually examine that word ufarinu itself, how we're understanding the translation of the word. The word ufarinu is clearly associated with the word pri, which means a fruit. So ufarinu would mean, and we will make and produce and have fruit. Since we're speaking about Hirchiv Hashem Lanu, we're speaking about human beings. So clearly, what would it mean by a person having fruit? This means being fruitful in regards to children, having sons and daughters, similar to what the pasuk says, Pru Revu, be fruitful and multiply, etc. On the other hand, in our case, it's different to Pru Revu. Why is that? When the pasuk says Pru Revu, Rashi tells us that if it would have only said the word pru, be fruitful, we would have understood it as each person only having one child. Since it says uravu, in addition to pru, in addition to be fruitful, it says multiply, now we understand that it actually means having, each person can have more than one child. In our case, when it says the word ufarinu, after having said, Ki ato hirchiv Hashem lanu, now that Hashem has given us plenty of space, now ufarinu, it doesn't make sense at all that the word ufarinu would mean that that Yitzchak is only having one child. In other words, ufarinu is coming to negate that a person shouldn't be barren and rather have a child. That's not in fitting with hirchiv. Hirchiv, plenty of space, would clearly mean having many children. If that's the case, how would we now understand ufarinu? So we have another pasuk, a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, which is speaking about that the Eibishter says, I'm not going to chase away the goyim all in one time out of the land, in case the land will become desolate, etc. And therefore it says, I'm going to chase away the goyim ma'at ma'at, slowly but surely. So, and then it says, until the time, asher tifra, until you will tifra. What does tifra mean over here? Tifra means there will be plenty of people, lots of people. So in other words, we understand the word tifra, and so too the word ufarinu over here, that clearly it could mean having many, many children. But if that's the case, the problem becomes Yitzchak and Rivka only had two children, Yaakov and Esav. Could that mean, for Rinu, could that possibly mean just two children, especially following from the word Hirchiv Hashem Lanu? And this is why Rashi comes along and tells us that the word Ufarinu over here is completely not the way we would have understood it, as in being fruitful in regards to having children. Not one child, not two children. Rather, v'nipush. What does v'nipush mean? Rashi told us elsewhere already the meaning of this word. In Parshas Bereshis, when it's discussing the 4 different rivers coming from Gan Eden, it says Shemo Echad, one of them is called Pishoin. Rashi says, why is it called Pishoin? Because the waters in it were extra blessed. They would come up and irrigate the land, and that's why it's called Pishoin. Rashi says, like another pasuk, Ufashu Parashav, which means the horsemen increased. In other words, we're speaking about not necessarily having children. That's not the word meaning over here at all. It doesn't mean fruitful. Rather, it's an expression of something by itself increasing, becoming more greater and greater. So too over here, when it says Ufarinu Baretz, it's referring to Yitzchak himself. We're not even referring to his children. The Yitzchak himself will increase and become greater and bigger, as the pasuk itself says, Vayigdalo ish, Vayelech holich v'godol. The man became greater and more prosperous. Ad ki gadol moed, until he became very great, and he has lots of sheep and cattle and avodah rabbah and plenty of enterprises and so on. In other words, Rashi is translating the word ufarinu, v'nipush, from the Targum as meaning something else completely, not being fruitful, but increasing and becoming greater. If that's the case, says the Rebbe, why does the Rashi even need to quote the Targum at all? Why does he need to say this from Targum Uncles? That seems to be obvious because of the pasuk itself. That must be the pshat in the pasuk, because Yitzchak didn't have many children, as said before. So the Rebbe says what Rashi is trying to tell us with saying the Targum is for the following idea. In most places where the Torah uses a word like pru or revu, these kind of expressions, the Targum actually most of the time translates it in this same word, pushu, which means to increase and to become bigger. In other words, according to the Targum, even when clearly we are speaking about having children, being fruitful, it also really means this same idea of pishyoin, of increasing. Because, of course, when a person has children, that's also adding to himself that now he's becoming more and bigger and greater. In other words, according to Targum, the word ufarinu, when we say that ufarinu means that the person himself is becoming more and greater, it's not taking away from the Pirush in other places. In other words, it's not an exception to the rule. Really, according to the Targum, whenever it says a word like ufarinu and pru or avu and so on, it always means increasing. In some cases, it's referring to the fact that a person is having children. In some places, it's referring to the person himself becoming greater. And that's why Rashi is quoting the Targum to show us that this word v'nipush is not telling us that in this case, the word ufarinu is an exception to the rule. Rather, this is what it always means. This is the word ufarinu always has the meaning of increasing. The Rebbe says, however, there's one more problem. Seemingly, what caused us to translate ufarinu in this way? Because we said Yitzchak only has 2 children. But l'cha'oira, we could say that it still does refer to having children, being fruitful in the sense of having children. It could still fit with Hirchiv Hashem Lanu, that Hashem gave us ample space and plenty of space. How does that fit with only having 2 children? Is because Rashi told us already in Parshas Vayera that grandchildren are considered like children. So possibly Ufarinu Ba'aretz could be referring to his grandchildren, to Yaakov's children, where he has 12 sons and Dinah, etc. Says the Rebbe, this is exactly why Rashi needs to also have the word Ba'aretz, Ufarinu Ba'aretz. We will increase in the land. And in the Targum he also brings V'nipush Ba'ara. Because since we're speaking about the land of Eretz Yisrael, Yaakov's children weren't born in Eretz Yisrael. And therefore Ufarinu Ba'aretz wouldn't be able to apply to them. And this is what's forcing Rashi to say that the translation of the word ufarinu over here is nothing to do with being fruitful, but as I said before, rather increasing and becoming bigger. The Rebbe says another thing to point out about this Rashi is, why does Rashi have to quote the words of the Targum? Why couldn't Rashi do as he does sometimes, just say Kit Targumoy as Targum renders it? And you could yourself look into Targum and see what Targum says. So the Rebbe says, because really in Targum there are two girsois, there's two versions in the Targum over here. There is one girsa that says v'yafshinono, and another girsa, as we quoted, is v'nipush. Rashi quotes the Targum to teach us that the correct girsa is v'nipush. Why is that relevant? Rashi usually doesn't have to tell us what the correct girsa in Targum is. It's because it actually is going to change the meaning of our pasuk. V'yafshinono would mean that he, meaning Hashem, will make us increase. Because in the pasuk before we're speaking about Hirchiv Hashem Lana, v'yafshinono means he will make us increase. On the other hand, v'nipush means we increase on our own, referring to Yitzchak and his family. The Rebbe is now going to explain this al pi Chassidus. The Rebbe says, Miyena shel Torah in this Rashi. Rashi is quoting, as we just said from the Targum, the word v'nipush ba'ara. That means this pasuk is really telling us two ideas. There's one idea, ki ato hirchiv Hashem lanu, what Hashem gave us. That comes milamayla, comes from above, the expansion that Hashem gave us. Then there's v'nipush ba'ara. There's us increasing, representing our avodah, what we come and achieve now. In other words, the person is created by the Eibishter, but the whole idea, the tachlis that the Eibishter created the Yid and gave us all of our koiches, hirchiv Hashem lanu, is that now we need to go ahead and work with all of that. As the pasuk says, Adam, a person is created for toil and for work. And the avodah is v'nipush be'ara. What does that mean? That he works with the land, he works with the world, with all the matters of the world, to make them increase even more than they were made by Hashem himself. In other words, he comes along and is revealing elikus through Torah and mitzvahs, even in a place that as far as the creation itself is concerned, there's no elikus begilui there. And now he's coming and adding that, as the Razal say, that a person through his avodah becomes a shutuf l'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, a partner to Hashem in Ma'aseh Bereishis, in the creation. Or furthermore, the Chazal tell us that just like the Eibishter is boirei olam, the Eibishter creates olamos, af avichem, so to your father. The obvious referring to is creating olamos. So you could come along and ask the question, how is such a thing possible? Since the Eibishter created the world and the Eibishter created it with its limitations, how could a person, or even a malach for that matter, any created being, come and change it and add to it? This is what the pasuk says. Ki ato hirchiv Hashem lanu. We need to realize that even the koiches, for whatever we're going to do, to add in the creation, that itself is coming from the Eibishter. Also, he is the one that gives us the koiches to go higher than all of our limitations, and therefore we can, and therefore it's our task to do it, to nullify the limitations of the world and to expand the world. Beruchnius, and automatically, of course, Begashmis as well, because we then bring in the brachos from the Eibishter, and the world, the land, gives out all of the produce, and so on. And as the Gemara says regarding Eretz Yisrael, that Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, is like compared to a deer, where the physical deer expands while it's, the Gemara says that, excuse me, during its lifetime, the skin of the deer is bigger. Suddenly, after it's not alive anymore, we wonder where it disappeared to all the space. But while it was there, it was able to expand according to what's needed. And says the same thing, Eretz Yisrael expands according to the bracha. To the extent that v'nipush be'ara, again, we bring this expansion into the land. Says the Rebbe, this is also hinted in the pasuk, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha hamalcha me'eretz Mitzrayim harchev picha v'amaleyu. I am Hashem that brings you up out of Mitzrayim, and you open your mouth and I will fill it. Says the Rebbe, here we again have these two ideas. On the one hand, that comes from above. The Eibishter takes us out of Mitzrayim. Harchav Picha v'Amaleyu is telling us we need to now open our mouths big. We need to now expound upon what the Eibishter gave us, even more than what the Eibishter gave us, even more than that which is there mitzad the creation. We have the ability to add and to expand that. By the way, before we go further in the sicha, we're soon going to go in. When we finish the sicha, we'll have a look a little bit into the ha'ara, a very fascinating and interesting ha'ara in regards to this pasuk. But here too, the Rebbe says we need to understand, since the Eibishter created our mouth in a specific way, with its limitations, and as we know, the Eibishter says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Misom Pel Adam, who is the one that gave a person a mouth? Of course, it's I, Hashem. So if the Eibishter gave us a mouth, how can we, Harchev Picha, make it even bigger? And here is what the pasuk tells us, in the beginning of that pasuk, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha hamalcha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I'm the one that lifts you up out of Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim represents limitations, but the Eibishter lifts us up out of these limitations. And on the contrary, as we said before, ufarinu ba'aretz, we could actually even increase and add even more. And what do we say? It doesn't say Hamitziacha that takes you out, like it says in most places. Rather, Hamalcha, which means he lifts us up, brings us up above and beyond all of the limitations. And therefore a Yid could come along, Harchev Picha, we could expand and make our mouths and the whole world bigger, removing and nullifying all of the limitations. In fact, this is the will and desire of the Eibishter when he created the world, that we should add to it through our avodah. And he is the one that gives us the koyach to be able to do it. Says the Rebbe, this is also the explanation of Pnimi Yisrael Yonim, in a very fascinating Gemara, where you have a person called Turnus Rufus Harasha, and he argues with Rabbi Akiva, and he says, if the Eibishter really loves the poor, why doesn't he feed them? In fact, he says, when you're giving them tzedakah, chas v'shalom, the people giving tzedakah are going to go to Gehenna. You're going against Hashem's will. The Eibishter wants this person to be poor, and you're now giving him money. Says Rabbi Akiva, where you're wrong is because a Yid is a child of the Eibishter. In other words, his argument was, Turnus Rufus Harasha's argument was, since the Eibishter created the poor people to be poor, how could you come and add and change that? How could you come and give them tzedakah? So says Rabbi Akiva that the Yidden are called Bonav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which will answer number one, how could we come along and give them tzedakah? As the Gemara is simply saying, because they're children of the Eibishter, of course the Eibishter would be happy that we come along and we help them. But also, how could we change the order of creation? Of course we can, because every Yid is a Chelek Alikami Ma'amamish. Every Yid is a child to the Eibishter. And therefore the Yid has the koyach to go beyond all of the limitations. And therefore it's not only not against Hashem's will, but on the contrary, this is what the Eibishter wants, that we should go out of the limitations of the world, and in fact, he is even the one that gives us the koyches to do it. Says the Rebbe, in this pasuk itself, it also says that Hashem is guaranteeing and gives us even more. In other words, not only he gives us the koyach before the avodah to be able to do it, but he's the one that helps us to do the avodah. And that the avodah should be able to bear fruit and come to its purpose and its ultimate. In other words, to add to the world. And as the pasuk says, va'amaleyu, that by the person doing his bit, harchev picha, opening your mouth wide, va'amaleyu, and the Eibishter says, I'm guaranteeing that I'm going to fulfill everything that you asked for and everything that you want. And this too, says the Rebbe, is hinted in the pasuk of Ufarinu Ba'aretz. What is Ufarinu Ba'aretz? It's not a tefillah, it's not a request, it's not a davening, it's not a doubt whether it will happen. Ufarinu is certain. Of course, Ufarinu Ba'aretz. Because I said before, we are guaranteed that if we fulfill the Ratzon of the Eibishter and we do the avodah that the Eibishter demands, then surely we're going to come to the Tachlis and we achieve not only Ufarinu Ba'aretz, increasing in the land, but as said in Lashon Kodesh, but also as Rashi brings us the Targum. V'nipush ba'ara means it's translated even into the Targum language, as explained in Chassidus, that Targum, when we have something that's not Lashon Kodesh, means that it's being brought down into a lower place, not only in a world as it's Lashon Kodesh, and even there, Olam is already in Lashon Helam, but rather bringing it down even lower, even into Yonei Choil, into worldly matters. And Ba'ara, I said before in the Targum Lashon, that even in the Ara, in the land, as it's in the lower level, is also becoming a dira for Hashem. And when all of this is fulfilled, will be fulfilled the promise also of a nigluk v'et Hashem beroch basar yachdov kipi Hashem dibur, that the whole world will see godliness in the world. At this point, I just want to go back to a very, very interesting ha'ara. It's one of the biggest ha'aras in Likutei Sichos, because there's a ha'ara and then a ha'ara on top of the ha'ara, and then there's what's called a ha'isafah la'achazman, an addition that was added afterwards. And interestingly enough, ba'ashgacha pratis, we're learning this right now in Tafshin Pei Aleph, and the ha'ara over here is built around also this number Pei Aleph. We mentioned earlier in the sicha the pasuk harchev picha va'amaleyu. So the Rebbe says in ha'ara 31 that this pasuk is in capital Pei Aleph in Tehillim. Pei Aleph, says the Rebbe, represents the same idea. Harchavas hapeh, broadening our mouth. Why is that? There's Pei and Pei Aleph. Pei already means a mouth. Peh in Lashon Kodesh means a mouth. Pei Aleph means that we're now going to add to the Peh, which is the Haisafa, the Harchev, after having the Peh, the Eibishter gives us a mouth, and now we're adding even more. Says the Rebbe, based on the minig that the Alter Rebbe got from the Baal Shem Tov, that was supposed to say the Tehillim in accordance to the age that a person is. So the Rebbe now says something very interesting. Who says this capital Tehillim? When someone turns 80, I mean, he's going into his 81st year. He's lived already 80 years. He's going into his 81st year. He's saying Kapitel Pei Aleph. So what's the idea? 80 represents the shleimus of nature. As the Pasuk says, a person lives in Begvurois, Shmoinim Shana. 80 years is already a beautiful life of shleimus of Teva. But now when you go into the following year, that means Harchava, you're going beyond the limitations of nature. And that's what we're now saying in Kapitel Pei Aleph. What are we saying? The same idea. This command and the koyach, that harchev picha v'amaleu, the Eibishter gave you a peh, but we could take it a step beyond that and go even further. Because there's some very interesting in Yodim in the Ha'ara over here, we'll just have a look a little bit more in some other things that the Rebbe says in the footnote on the footnote. And the Rebbe says something very, very interesting. This idea that we say the kapitel according to the age is hinted in a very, very interesting way in Kapitel Ayin Beis in Tehillim. Kapitel Ayin Beis in Tehillim finishes off with the words Kolu Sfilois David ben Yishai. Now is the end of the Tfilos of David HaMelech. Now we know that the Gemara says that David HaMelech, any kapitel that was specially beloved for David HaMelech, he started with the word Ashrei and finished with the word Ashrei. And the Gemara gives an example over there from the beginning of Tehillim, which starts off Ashrei Ha'ish and finishes off Ashrei Kol Choisei Voi. But hang on a minute. Ashrei Kol Choisei Voi is the end of Kapitel Beis. So according to the Gemara, in some counts, we count Aleph and Beis as one kapitel, which is another interesting thing that Rebbe deals with as well in the Hara, that there's a number of different counts in Tehillim, and the Rebbe answers some questions of the Mefarshim, and the Rebbe says it's not a problem why we have different counts, because even in Chumash there's different counts. Sometimes we count 5 Chumashim, sometimes we count it as 7 Chumashim, so there's not a problem why we have different counts. But the Rebbe says, if we look at Aleph and Beis as one kapitel, so Kapitel Ayin Beis is actually Kapitel Ayin Aleph in that count, in David HaMelech's count. So when David HaMelech is 70 years old, he passes away when he's 70 years old, which kapitel is he saying? Kapitel Ayin Aleph. This is when we say Kolu Sfilois is the end of the Tfilois of David ben Yishai. As I said, there's even a further part to the Ha'ara, which makes it all the more interesting. And the Rebbe in the later part of the Ha'ara, which is, as it says over here in L'Kutei Sichos, or Yisaf Al-Achazman, something added afterwards, the Rebbe actually explains this concept of why sometimes the first 2 kapitlach are counted as one and sometimes counted as 2 separate kapitlach. Why by David HaMelech himself it's counted as one, and for most of the times in history we count it as 2 kapitlach. And the general idea, what the Rebbe says over here, as we're just going through the general point of these ha'aras, not going word for word, but the general nukuda that the Rebbe says is that Ashrei or Ish is speaking about a yid that's acting and doing the right things, learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, and so on and so forth. Comes the next kapitel, Lama Rakshu Goyim, which is a kapitel which is basically saying, how dare the Goyim even think that he could start up with the Yidden. The Eibishter is sitting and laughing in heaven. There's no chance for the Goyim to be successful, and so on and so forth. When times are ideal, like in the time of David HaMelech, these two ideas come together. They're one tkufa, they're one period. It's all happening at the same time in the times of David HaMelech, for example. Yidden are learning Torah, Yidden are doing mitzvahs, Yidden are at the highest level. There's no chance even for Goyim to start up with the Yidden. So it's all seen as one unit. However, for most of the time of Golus, it's actually 2 separate things. There's individuals that are, of course, acting and doing the right things, but to come along and say, wow, how could there even be a svara that Goyim should even start up with the Yidden? Unfortunately, for most of the time of the Golus, it's not exactly like that. When Mashiach will come, we'll turn around and say, wow, Lama Rakshu Goyim. The Goyim don't even have a chance. And this is what the Rebbe says, that in the times of David HaMelech, the 2 kapitlach are seen as one kapitel. In other words, it's one inyan. But for most of the time, these 2 inyanim are actually seen as 2 separate kapitlach. So this is more or less the general idea of what the Rebbe gives over in this Ha'ara.